we'll hand over to you now.
All right,
We
we have
just
to
hit
hit
continue.
continue.
Well, first, we would like to start by thanking Robin, Gay, Mark, and Owen for making this possible this morning. We've had the opportunity to speak at a number of settings, recovery groups that our son was involved with, university in Southern California. And this is the first time we've done a meeting via Zoom. And we are very happy to be able to do this. And thanks to each of you for all of the roles that you've played in making this possible for us.
Can you hear us?
Yes, no, you're doing very well.
We can.
Okay, all right. Well, I want to thank you also for the opportunity to be here with you this way today. And I want to tell you that we're going to read our story for two reasons. One is that we're too old to memorize it. And the other reason is that it keeps us on track. So we've, in our presentations that we've done in the States, recovery centers and mental health conferences and things, we have a 10-minute story. And it's the synopsis of what we're about. So you're going to see us reading off of our iPad above. So let's start. After many years of marriage, we were finally blessed with a daughter. Then 6 years later, a son. We were the typical parents of the 80s and 90s. We were intentional, devoted, and somewhat indulgent. Relationships were a high priority for us, along with the desire to instill a strong moral compass for our children to follow. Our daughter became an accomplished horsewoman and earned degrees in Spanish, Italian, and Latin American studies. After her graduation, she married an Aussie and is living in Melbourne with our two beautiful granddaughters. Our son is an avid rock climber and off-road enthusiast and earned his degrees in political science and law. He turns 31 this year, is newly married, and is practicing criminal law for those marginalized by society in Los Angeles. It's the perfect American dream. Sadly, it's not entirely true.
Our son, John Life, is my first name and my father's first name. And this Trang is actually a Norwegian, and D'Amelio is Italian, as you might imagine. Well, John Life had been introduced to hard liquor and pot while in middle school. In his last year there, he was also introduced to something called OxyContin, which you've probably heard of, by a good friend. We had no idea, and we assumed that his increased agitation and moodiness were the result of normal changes in young teens. During his freshman year in high school, he became fully addicted to oxys, and in his sophomore year, he was introduced to something called BT, short for black tar heroin. Older friends at a party were smoking BT, and it didn't seem like a deadly drug to him as an invincible 16-year-old. In the spring of that year, we realized that something was dreadfully wrong with our son when we heard him say, "Why do you keep frustrating me? Do you want me to be one of those kids that gets so frustrated and angry with their parents that they end up shooting them?" In 2005, we had never heard of BT heroin. We had no clue that it was not only available, but being delivered to our son's affluent high school, and it was easier to get than alcohol and just as cheap. Just before the end of his sophomore year, there'd been a drug bust when many of his friends were caught using at school and sent away to long-term residence treatments programs. We didn't hear about this until a decade later. The strong code of silence surrounding the image of success and excellence at our community school, where deadly drugs were being regularly sold and used, held firm.
In June of that year, when JL was 16, we uncovered the evidence we were searching for that would explain the change in his personality. We confronted him about his drug use. He wept in remorse and was ready and willing for help. With health insurance that didn't cover mental health or addiction, we weren't able to afford the $70,000 to $100,000 long-term programs that many of his friends' parents had sent their children to. We finally found an in-town outpatient program, especially for teens with addiction. What we failed to do was to begin attending the family classes that were imperative for us as his codependents. We naively thought this was a one-off problem, and we had no idea it would become a life and death battle for our son. We didn't know the significance of the genetic component of addiction. We didn't know how early exposure to substances would create physical changes in a still growing body and brain. We just didn't know. He remained clean from opioids for 2.5 years, but during his freshman year at the U of A, he had a serious accident with a concussion, broken bones, and a body brace, and opioid therapy, which led to a relapse recovery cycle that lasted for years.
Just a year away from graduating at 24, due to on and off alcohol and opioid abuse, he broke up with a long-term girlfriend, went to a sober living home in northern Arizona, sold vacuums door to door, and was kicked out after 6 months. He came back to Tucson, and we believed and hoped that he was clean and sober and ready to return to work and university. By Thanksgiving weekend of November 2013, he still did not have a job. He was going through detox once again from black tar heroin. He entered a sober living house in Tucson where, unfortunately, the house manager was dealing BT and using with him. Later, we learned that our son, who said he would never stick a needle in his veins, was doing just that.
In January of 2014, we went together to see his addiction doctor, where we heard these chilling words: "Opioid addiction is the cancer of addictions. This young man cannot relapse again. He will not survive." Given the choice to have our son start medicated assisted treatment using Suboxone, we opted out due to the high cost with no insurance coverage and the desire to no longer be involved in his recovery. We thought that finding a better sober living home and harder work by our son was the answer. We thought, and sadly we thought wrong.
He did find a good sober living home, and he did work hard. He worked very hard. February through June of 2014, we actually had our son back. He was engaged with life, working 2 jobs, building new relationships with the young men at the home. He was smiling, sweetly interacting with his 2 young nieces and our daughter while they were visiting us from Australia. We sighed gratefully with relief. In mid-June, he was with old friends four-wheeling. They were drinking and getting drunk, and he joined them. The following week, his wisdom teeth were impacted and infected, and he needed the inevitable surgery and opioids. We didn't insist that he have the surgery without them. So for 10 days before and after, the oral surgeon prescribed large doses of opioids along with the antibiotics. While recovering at our home, we realized that our son was no longer his true self, but disappearing again into the empty shell. We didn't realize that he was using prescription opioids to cover a relapse on IV heroin. A week after lying in bed, we sent him back to the sober living home.
By the next week, he said he was ready to leave the sober house and move into an apartment with a friend that was not a drug user. Thursday, he came over for dinner with us, and as he left, we hugged each other, and he said once again, "Thank you, Mom and Dad, for everything you've done for me." Friday night, he called about 10 p.m. to tell us how excited he was to be in his new place, and he hoped that we could come over the next day to see it. We said our good nights and our mutual I love yous. The next morning, August 2nd, John answered a knock at the door. There was a sheriff's deputy, and he asked, "Are you the parents of John Life Trang? I'm sorry to have to inform you that your son is dead."
Well, that day, the world changed forever, and the new normal that we've had to adjust to has never become normal or right or understandable.
After that difficult first day, we called our friends Mark and Marcy, who are pastors at our local church, and they told us to come right over. They wept with us, prayed with us, and reminded us of our eternal hope of seeing our son again, and then compassionately led us through the steps we needed to take in order to plan a memorial for John Life at their church. After the memorial, then, in those dark days, weeks, and months, we kept a journal together for a year. In the beginning, it was a way for us to hold on to our son and our sanity, and to put on paper what was actually too terrifying to say out loud because it would make it all real. During the year after his death, as we learned more about our son from his friends near and far, as we went through all the stages of grief, and as we spoke about our son's death to anyone who would listen, we realized how many people had loved ones whose families were suffering just as we were. It was also in that year that the opioid epidemic became national news in the United States, and information and statistics were becoming easier to find. The Big Fix, Dreamland, American Pain were all published and released, all dealing with opioid addiction from different angles while revealing underlying issues common to our society, which were pursuing affluence and avoiding pain at all costs, using pills that are pushed by greedy billionaires and small entrepreneurs through deceptive information and very intense marketing, the ease and availability of increasingly potent and highly addictive illegal drugs, and a breakdown in communal life as a nation, which created the void for these drugs to fill. What we've learned in the 5 years since our son died is that sometimes it takes a broken heart to see the light of day, and that having a child with addiction issues, more appropriately named substance use disorder, or SUD, carries with it a social stigma that causes most parents to recoil in shame, never speaking about their child, isolating them and their grief, their regrets, and their now empty and aching hearts. It's the same stigma that surrounds suicide and mental health issues. Paul Tournier said, "Nothing makes us so lonely as our secrets." And once we realized this, we understood that we had to share our story.
There's more scientific data now that helps explain why willpower and community alone were not enough to help our son beat the deadly death hold that opioids had on his brain and his life. Just as a person doesn't choose to struggle with mental health issues, he did not want to be addicted. No one does. But the fear of living without the joy plant and the resultant shame associated with using kept him from being unable to verbalize it and kept us from understanding those fears. We now realize that, especially for the millions who have begun alcohol and drug use as young people.
I'm sorry, I've just, there we go.
Medication those who have been using regularly, medication-assisted treatment is essential, and recovery programs such as CRAFT or SMART that teach empathy with boundaries and self-empowerment can work well alongside the 12-step programs. The statistics indicate that it takes 8 years and 4 to 5 recovery attempts to gain 1 year of sobriety from opioids. And the quote is, "You cannot recover if you've died from an overdose."
So we have found that our sorrow is a gift that we've been lent so that we may help others. To this end, we started our blog 3 years ago and have written and published our book, Opiate Nation, so that we can help families with children prevent early exposure for addiction and avoid the pitfalls and dangers that we didn't see coming, so that those struggling with addiction will become free of shame and find hope in knowing that there is help for them to change their lives. and so that those who have lost a loved one may be strengthened for their journey through the comfort that our story can offer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jude and John, and we do appreciate that your vulnerability in sharing your painful story, but a story of hope that is designed to assist others on similar or even different journeys. To our members, you may have a question that you would like to ask. If you can just indicate in the reactions button.
May I mention something else as well? And
Yes, John.
we've found that in every setting, whether it's been 500 people at a university campus or 15 people at a book signing, inevitably someone has an addiction story, either someone they know, something personal, a friend. And I realized that for our group this morning, opiate addiction and something called black tar heroin, this is all probably very, very foreign to the majority of us in the room today. Although we're also aware that there are other addictive issues that are very, very common in Australia. And just in the event you're not aware, we've spoken with a number of drug specialists throughout, well, in the Melbourne area specifically, and read a great deal. Jude's done an incredible amount of work in preparation for the book. And heroin is something that has been in Australia since the very beginning. It is still there. It doesn't get the notoriety necessarily that crack cocaine may get, or that alcohol abuse may get, crystal meth. I've found it very, very interesting. In America, our pharmaceutical companies are permitted to advertise on commercial television. So our news hours are filled with every conceivable prescription drug that you might need to have this time, because you always need something. Well, interestingly, we see here during the commercial news hours, one ad after the next about gambling. That's not a big issue in America, but it certainly seems to be something that a lot of people are involved with here. And addictive behaviors of all sorts follow the very same paths. So we would be delighted to hear. I know it probably would be intimidating to share personal stories, but we would love for you to do that if you'd like. Jude, as I said, has done an incredible amount of research in putting the book together, and we would be happy to answer any questions that may come to mind. We hope that whatever we do share, both previously and for the remaining time, may be of some help to some person in the room, whether it's your granddaughter or a great-granddaughter or a grandson or your own son. So I'll stop.
Thank you, John. And I certainly would encourage the members to order the book online, Opiate Nation, where we can learn more of the depths of your story and learn from that. Kylie, you had a question?
I just wanted to raise, I work in the corrections environment, and certainly we hear a lot in Victoria about the ice epidemic, but in reality, heroin's actually on the rise. It's actually cheaper for people to access and locate heroin than it is ice sometimes. And heroin is actually more addictive than the ice for some of our offenders within the Victorian system. So I just wanted to flag that.
That confirms what one of the we met last summer. I get last July with the director of Shark, and we were speaking about this. And I said, we hear about ice all the time in Australia. We just don't hear about it. And he said, heroin's under the radar. Ice, crystal meth gets a lot more publicity because of the behavior it creates in people, of the violence, of the random wild activities of the people then you physically see. They lose their teeth, they get spots, they kill people. Whereas heroin is, of course, by nature something that is a much more solitary, it's not usually a group drug, it's not a party drug. Because it's a narcotic and a downer, then that's when people nod off. So that was exactly confirming what you said. And we will say, I know that you would know this and have heard it, with the advent, there were two things that have happened. In the States around 2015, 16, 17 is when, around 2015, which was about a year after our son died, the coroners and recovery people were finding out that there were, like when our son died, extremely potent heroin had hit the markets in the United States. And that was the first thing that our son's autopsy revealed, was that the amount of heroin he had in his system was way beyond what he would have normally used. And it wasn't because he was unfamiliar with it. And through researching and finding out, what had happened was that around 2014-15, China had figured out a way to genetically modify the poppy seed, and they had come up with two things. One way to make it more potent, and the other way was to get 3 crops a year out of it. So not only was there more heroin flooding the market, it was stronger. Then, of course, after that, the advent of the synthetic opioid, in particular fentanyl and carfentanil, which now in the US we've been dealing with for about 3 years, and you all are dealing with now, is being formulated into drugs. For us, it's sent to Mexico. Then Mexico is formulating it into pills that look like the benzos, like Xanax and Restoril. It looks like OxyContin. It looks like MDMA, the party drugs. And what happens is that then, of course, as you know, one tiny little grain of fentanyl mixed in with another drug, even put in with marijuana, then people can just overdose so quickly. So the stakes have really been upped.
Thank you. Jude, over to you, Jeff. You've got a question?
John and Jude, thanks for sharing that story. A tragic one that probably brings back many memories for you, but hopefully through your work, many other families, many other people's lives are going to be changed positively. Could you bring the microscope back down to that local community that you began by talking about? Can you articulate whether there's been any changes in culture at that local school, or the way that it's now operating that would hopefully change the course of people's lives in a different direction?
We haven't had intimate contact with the leadership at that school, although we did speak with a woman who was a friend of ours from years and years ago, who was the district nurse for that school system. Her impression was they're trying to do a responsible job of communicating issues like this to the school community. But what we've actually found in dealing and speaking with the rehab counselors, who we've grown very close to as well in the Tucson area, is that the stigma associated particularly with heroin abuse, there's stigma with all addictions, but for some reason, it's when you say my son died of a heroin overdose, it's like people just don't want to say those words. So the stigma still prevents the public community from really embracing and addressing this. Now, in the 5 years since it's became a national epidemic in America, clearly much progress has been made, and we're very thankful for that. And one of our desires, of course, is what has happened in the book. It was originally a chronological sequence of these 12 months, just basically with me apologizing for being a crap dad and telling JL how much I loved him, and for Jude and I sharing, we just can't believe the time is continuing to progress because it's just not possible. You're not here in it with us. But what happened, Jude was encouraged to turn the memoir into a series of essays, which she is actually exceptionally good at presenting a simple story topically regarding addiction, genetics, stigma, shame, guilt, grief, all the different aspects of that. And our hope, as you just shared when you asked this question, is that our story will actually prevent other families from experiencing the same pain that we've experienced. And I'm happy to say that we are aware of many, many, many instances where this has occurred.
I'll add to that by saying, I think what came upon us like out of the blue was that these things were available at middle school level. And, you know, we've all watched shows where you know that people who deal drugs are ruthless and their whole goal is to make money. Our son's middle school, at that time, the black tar heroin was not being dealt and delivered to middle school. What was there, which is common and which we find as a disturbing element for Australia, and that we're trying to speak about here, is the prevalence of prescription opioids. And at that time, so this was 2003 when he was in middle school. I mean, who would have thought that people would have used opioids for anything other than for pain? And so, of course, now that's very, very big in the radar in the States, and Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, and their deceptive marketing. But what the reports that I've seen relating to Australia are that you are definitely behind in this aspect than America, and that Purdue Pharma's subsidiaries are still promoting the safety of opioids and the lack of problem with addiction for them, for people to take them. We have a friend who's a malpractice lawyer.
Sorry, Jude, I might have to cut you off there. If you are, just because of the length of the time of the meeting and people have got commitments afterwards. Excellent. If you are available at the end of the meeting, you're welcome to perhaps hang around, as they say, and there may be further questions. But we certainly appreciate your wealth of knowledge on this topic, and the very personal nature of it, and your willingness to share your story to help others. It's highly commendable, and we're so grateful that you've been with us today. I'll now just need to.
And may we just add, would you be able to send out the Jude's email address? We have a local Australia phone number. We have her website for the blog that she writes. Could we do that in a group email to the?
Yes, certainly. So
excellent.
Send all those details to your contact in the club, and we can include it in our weekly bulletin.
Perfect.
So thank you so much, and I'll hand back now to our President, Gay.
Jude and John, thank you so much for your talk this morning. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that it's been a tough road for you, and that we hopefully can all learn something from it. What we do normally is I hand you a certificate. I can't do that, but we will email you a certificate, and at the same time we'll make a donation on your behalf to one of our signature projects. It's called Operation Cleft, and we do cleft palate and cleft lip operations for children in Bangladesh. So we'll make a donation on your behalf to that charity. So thank you again very much. for the rest of you, just one thing, just a little bit of a protocol thing. If you have a look down the bottom of your screen where it says participants, can you click on that, please, for me now?
I'll get it on there.
See, you're down the bottom. Now, if you have a look at the sidebar that comes up, there's a message down the very bottom that says raise your hand. And if you click on that, you get a little hand appearing beside your name. And that will make it easier for look, lots of people are doing it, I can see. And what that does, it makes it easier for whoever's chairing to see who's got a question or wants to speak. So can we remember that for next week? That'd be great. And other than that, thank you again to Mark for setting up and hosting the meeting again this morning. It's been great to see everyone. I think that if you're like me, I haven't seen, other than on Zoom, I haven't seen anyone for a whole week nearly. So it's been nice to see some faces. And I think we're all at this stage being very aware of our surroundings, and certainly I've cleaned out lots of cupboards and done lots of gardening, so I'm sure you're all doing the same. But just reminder of next week, Liz, you are chair for next week, and Kath said that our speaker is happy to come along, and it's Karen Pill from the Whitehorse Winter Shelter 2020. So that'll be something that we'll be all able to listen to next week. So thank you again for our visitors, Ray and Anne and Kylie. Thank you for coming along. And for everyone else that's been here too, it's been great to see you all. So we can finish the meeting there.